Gospel text that we have today is one of the most difficult that we have to deal with in all of the Gospel. It's difficult because we don't completely understand everything that Jesus is telling us. And Jesus, as he did in the parables, is speaking in a code that many of us don't necessarily understand today. And so now he is teaching his disciples, and the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, were hanging around and they were listening in. And when Jesus got to that part where he said you can't serve two masters, God and money, the Pharisees start to make fun of him. They start to laugh. You know, the truth of the matter is that Jesus knew that the Pharisees should have been teaching what he was teaching. The Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. The Pharisees were among those who were called by God to teach about God. But the Pharisees, you see, they got all caught up in the fact that they were God's people. They got all caught up in their pride. They got all caught up in being connected with God. And they looked down on those who weren't connected with God in their eyes, in their minds. And so, as they are mocking him, Jesus then tells this story. And in this story, we have three primary actors, three primary people that we need to focus on. One is the rich man. We don't know his name, but we do know some things about him. First of all, he's very rich. He's blessed. He is very blessed. He wears purple and fine linen. Now, there would have been no mistaking to the Pharisees who Jesus was identifying there. The priesthood wore linen. That was part of their official garb. And purple was reserved for royalty. And of course, back in the Old Testament, Moses tells us that God has called the people of God, God has called the people of Israel to be a royal priesthood. So Jesus is clearly, in the minds of the Pharisees, talking about them. He's talking about those people who claim to be the chosen people of God. The second person in this story that Jesus is telling to the Pharisees is named Lazarus. He has a name. That's an interesting fact in and of itself, that the rich man doesn't have a name, but Lazarus does. And Lazarus literally means in Hebrew, God is my help. Interesting. A very interesting name for this poor man who sits outside the gate with sores and not enough to eat. How in the world, in the Pharisees' minds, would this man be named Lazarus? God is my help. In addition to that, the Pharisees would have clearly understood that this would have been someone from outside the people of Israel. This would have been Gentiles sitting out at the gate of Jerusalem begging, oftentimes with leprosy, oftentimes with other diseases. It's also interesting that Jesus says the dogs licked his sores. That was a common term that the Pharisees and the Jews would have used to describe Gentiles, dogs. So Jesus is saying not only are these people outside the gate, not only is Lazarus representing these people outside the gate, But the people outside the gate are like the Good Samaritan, providing care for Lazarus instead of the people of God. Because you see, you have to go back into the history of the people of God. God blessed Abraham and Sarah. And God said to Abraham and Sarah clear back in Genesis, go, and if you go, I will make of you a great nation. And you, Abraham and Sarah, you will be blessed. But it doesn't end there. God says, and through you, all of the nations will be blessed. God is clearly saying to Father Abraham and Mother Sarah, do not hold on to the blessings that I give you. And yet, at this time in Jerusalem, at this time in the history of the people of God, the people of God, the Israelites, those who were called to be blessings to the whole world, are holding on to those blessings. And they're prideful. They're prideful of their connection to God. They're prideful of who they are. And they say, well, look, God has blessed us. God has blessed us indeed. So that means that we can live lavishly. And we can be proud of the fact that we're God's people. Well, as Paul Harvey says, now you also know the rest of the story. That's what Jesus seems to be saying here. He seems to say to those Pharisees, he seems to say, you people are proud. You live in a lavish life. You've been richly blessed by God. And right outside, within your vision, are people who are not so richly blessed. People who are suffering greatly. And you have so much, and they have nothing. You don't tend to their needs. The dogs do. And then he tells the interesting story about what happens. These Gentiles, that Lazarus represents. When they die, they are with Father Abraham. And Father Abraham indeed is a blessing to them. But not so. Not so with the rich man and the people of God. Now, I lay that background out for you because I want you to understand the dynamic that was going on here. The religious leaders of the day, the people of the day who were God's chosen people. And what Jesus' perspective of them really was. And how he looked at the poor, the downtrodden, and those who the people of God considered to be on the outside. Now, of course, I can't help but bring that into our modern day society. Think about where we live. Think about how richly blessed we are. Indeed, we are blessed. We are so incredibly blessed. Bishop DeFries tells a story of a time when he was so incredibly moved. He was with some folks from Tanzania, and they went out to western Nebraska. And the folks from Tanzania said, "What is the worst problem that you have out here?" And the folks in western Nebraska said, "Well, the drought. It's terrible, terrible drought." And the folks from Tanzania said, "And how far do you have to walk to get your water?" It was a profound statement, a profound question in Bishop DeFries' mind. Because indeed, even though there was substantial drought, all the folks in western Nebraska had to do was turn the faucet on. But in the minds of others, when they heard how horrible it was, they thought to their own experience. We live in a nation right now where in a few months our state legislators are going to gather. And one of our legislators is going to bring forward a bill. And that bill will be very much like the Arizona law that was recently passed. I've done a substantial amount of research on that. And what I've come to understand in doing my research is that our federal immigration law is incredibly broken. We often hear about people who come here illegally. And first of all, in Nebraska, only 3.4% of the total population is here illegally. 3.4% of 1.8 million people. If all of those people who were here illegally left the state of Nebraska, we would lose $154 million in state revenue, tax dollars that they pay. If all of those people who were here illegally in Nebraska left, we would lose $828 billion in economic activity. It's a substantial economic impact on our state. But also what I came to find out, and I'm a lawyer, I should have known this. But what I came to find out about our immigration laws is that it's virtually impossible for anyone from Mexico to come here legally. I hear people say all the time, well, I don't care if they come, they just need to come legally. Well, under current federal law, that is next to impossible. The only way that a person from Mexico or Central America can come here legally is if they have a family member who is a United States citizen and that family member agrees to sponsor them. That's the only way they can come legally. Now, former President George W. Bush recognized that. And former President George W. Bush brought an immigration reform bill to Congress. And for political reasons, it failed. President Obama has, again, urged a bill to be passed. But the political climate today is that if I support illegal immigration, I'm not going to get elected to office. Now, it makes all of us uncomfortable when I talk about this. I know, it makes me uncomfortable when I talk about this. But we have to talk about uncomfortable things in the church. What was Jesus talking about to the Pharisees that day? It was terribly uncomfortable for the Pharisees. But what Jesus was saying is, look, people, you have so much, and right outside of your gate are people who are absolutely suffering in abject poverty. And what are you doing? You're walking by them every day and ignoring. What is Jesus saying to us?